The theater was full of lights, cameras, and the sound of chatter as people settled into their seats. It was the kind of night people waited for all week, a big singing competition that everyone watched, whether in the theater or on television at home. Excitement buzzed in the air, and people whispered about who would be the next big star to walk on stage. Most of the contestants were young, stylish, and full of energy, carrying dreams of fame and fortune. The audience expected more of the same that evening. But then, something unusual happened. Slowly, from the corner of the stage, an old woman appeared. She walked carefully, her steps measured, as if every movement needed thought and care. She wore a simple dress, nothing glamorous or shiny like the other performers. Her gray hair was neatly tied back, her hands a little shaky as she gripped the microphone stand. For a moment, the room grew quiet, not because people were amazed, but because they were confused. People leaned forward, squinting at her. Some whispered into their neighbors' ears. "What is she doing here?" one person said under their breath. "This must be some kind of joke," another chuckled. A few laughed out loud, not cruelly, but with the kind of amusement people have when they think something is out of place. After all, this was a stage for the young and ambitious, not for someone who looked like she could be a grandmother. Even the judges raised their eyebrows. They sat at their grand table, polished and stylish, with cameras capturing every expression. One of them, a world-famous singer known for his quick tongue and sharp humor, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. He whispered something to the judge beside him, and both of them laughed. The cameras caught it, and the audience joined in. To many, it felt certain that this was going to be awkward, maybe even embarrassing. The host, standing at the side of the stage, asked her gently, "What's your name?" Her voice was soft, carrying a little tremble, but it was clear enough. "Margaret," she said, smiling politely. "And how old are you, Margaret?" the host asked, trying to keep the mood light. She replied, "I'm 68 years old." There was a ripple of surprise in the audience, followed by more whispers and scattered giggles. The famous singer judge raised his eyebrows dramatically, rolling his eyes in a way that drew laughter from the crowd. He then leaned into the microphone and said, "Well, this should be interesting. Let's see what Grandma can do." The room laughed, and the old woman stood there, taking it all in. Margaret didn't answer back. She didn't argue or defend herself. She simply adjusted the microphone with her trembling hands, took a slow breath, and looked out into the sea of faces. Behind her calm eyes, though, a storm of emotions swirled. She could feel the weight of doubt pressing on her shoulders. It was not the first time in her life she had been underestimated. As she waited for the music to start, her thoughts traveled back through the years. She remembered herself as a young girl, standing barefoot in her family's small kitchen, singing while her mother cooked. Her mother would sometimes stop stirring the pot just to listen, smiling proudly as Margaret's young voice filled the room. Music had always been her secret language, the way she expressed her deepest feelings. She had dreamed once, long ago, of singing on a stage like this. But life had different plans. She married young, worked long hours, raised children, and carried the weight of everyday struggles. There had been no time for stages, no spotlight waiting for her. Instead, she sang in her church choir, at small family gatherings, or to comfort her children when they were afraid. Decades had passed, and the dream that once burned brightly had quietly gone to sleep inside her heart. And yet, something inside her had never fully let go. Even now, at 68, with her children grown and her hair silver, she found herself standing on the stage, holding a microphone that felt heavier than it should. The crowd doubted her, the judges mocked her, but she knew this was her chance not to prove them wrong, but to prove to herself that the dream was still alive. The cameras zoomed in on her face. Viewers at home could see the lines of age that marked her skin, but they could also see her eyes calm, steady, and filled with quiet determination. She didn't care about the laughter. She didn't even care about the smirk of the famous singer sitting in judgment. What she cared about was this moment, this song, and the chance to finally let her voice be heard. The music technician nodded, and the soft introduction of her chosen song began to play. The audience leaned forward, ready for what they believed would be a disaster. Some had already prepared to laugh again. The famous singer crossed his arms, ready to enjoy the show for the wrong reasons. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, as if whispering a silent prayer. She thought about her late husband, who had always told her she had a gift. She thought about her grandchildren, who had begged her to try out for this show. "Grandma, you're amazing," they had said, their little eyes full of belief. And she thought about the young girl she used to be, the one who had dreamed of a night like this. When she opened her eyes again, there was a different look in them. The tremble in her hands disappeared. Her back straightened just a little more, and her fingers wrapped firmly around the microphone. The introduction of the song played its last few notes, and the time had come. Margaret took a deep breath, preparing for the very first word she would sing. The audience went silent, waiting, almost hungry for the chance to be entertained, whether by failure or surprise. In that single breath before she began, Margaret felt everything: her past, her struggles, her laughter, her tears, her love, and her losses. All of it gathered inside her like a quiet fire, ready to pour out. This was not just a song for her. This was her story, her life, her heart. And with that, she opened her mouth to sing. The first note was only seconds away, yet those few seconds stretched like hours for Margaret. She could feel every pair of eyes locked on her, waiting, judging, expecting failure. The famous singer on the judges' panel still had that amused smile, tapping his pen against the table, as though he was certain this performance would be something to laugh about later. Margaret's fingers tightened around the microphone. Her heart was beating faster than the rhythm of the song, but she refused to let it show. She had been through too much in life to let nervousness win. She had lived through sleepless nights when her children were sick, through mornings when bills were stacked high on the table, through the aching silence of losing her husband after years of marriage. Compared to all of that, this stage was nothing. Yes, it was frightening, but it was also beautiful, a chance she thought she'd never get again. As she waited for her cue, the music floated gently through the theater. It was soft, slow, and filled with space for a voice to rise and shine. Margaret closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the melody wrap around her. The sound steadied her breathing, calmed her shaking hands, and reminded her that this was not about the judges, not about the cameras, and not even about the laughter she had heard moments ago. This was about her love for music, the love that had never left her no matter how many years passed. She opened her eyes again, and in them there was a spark. The cameras caught it, the kind of spark people recognize when someone has decided not to give up. She leaned a little closer to the microphone, and the first note came out. The theater, which had been buzzing with whispers and small laughs, went quiet. Her voice wasn't shaky like they expected. It was clear, strong, and rich with emotion. Every word carried weight, every sound carried meaning. The whispers stopped instantly. People leaned forward in their seats, almost in disbelief at what they were hearing. Margaret didn't notice their surprise, not yet. She was lost in the music, her voice flowing out as naturally as breathing. She remembered singing lullabies to her children late at night when they couldn't sleep, her voice soft but steady. She remembered singing hymns in the church choir, where neighbors would often turn around with tears in their eyes, touched by the sincerity of her voice. She remembered her husband telling her that her singing could move mountains if only she believed in herself. Now, in this moment, she let all of that flow through her. The famous singer who had smirked earlier shifted in his chair. His eyes narrowed, not with mockery this time, but with a spark of recognition. This was not what he expected. He leaned forward, listening more closely. Margaret's voice carried through the theater, filling every corner, touching every ear, and reaching every heart. She sang not with the polish of someone trained in music schools, but with the raw, genuine beauty of someone who had lived a full life and poured it all into song. Her voice had a depth that spoke of joy and sorrow, of love and loss, of resilience and hope. The audience, who had moments ago been ready to laugh, now sat in silence. A few mouths hung open. One young woman in the crowd clasped her hands to her chest, her eyes watering. A man in the back shook his head slowly, as if amazed at how wrong he had been. Margaret felt the energy of the room shifting. She could sense it, even though her eyes stayed closed for much of the performance. For years, she had sung without anyone really listening. But now, every person in the theater was hearing her, not just the sound of her voice, but the story behind it. She reached the chorus, her voice rising higher, stronger, as if lifting up years of silence and letting them finally be free. It was not just singing. It was storytelling through sound. Every line carried the truth of her life, wrapped in notes that soared with surprising power. For the first time since she had stepped onto the stage, Margaret opened her eyes wide. She saw people leaning forward, their faces filled with awe. She saw the judges exchanging glances, no longer laughing. She saw the famous singer resting his chin on his hand, his smirk gone, replaced with something closer to respect. Margaret smiled, just a little, as she kept singing. She wasn't smiling to prove anyone wrong. She was smiling because she had finally found her voice again, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they were too old, too late, or not good enough. The second verse flowed even more smoothly than the first. With each note, her confidence grew. The stage lights no longer felt blinding, instead, they felt like a spotlight she had earned. The microphone no longer felt heavy, it felt like an old friend, carrying her voice farther than she ever thought possible. She thought of her grandchildren, probably sitting at home watching her on television. She imagined their wide eyes and excited cheers as they realized their grandmother wasn't just good, she was incredible. That thought pushed her to sing even more passionately, her voice filling the hall with warmth and strength. The audience began to nod their heads with the rhythm, some even wiping their eyes as they listened. It was as if the whole room had forgotten where they were and simply allowed themselves to be carried by the beauty of the moment. The famous singer judge finally sat up straight, his arms no longer crossed. He whispered something to the judge beside him, but this time it wasn't a joke. This time, it was acknowledgement. He tapped his hands softly on the table in rhythm with the song, watching Margaret with a look that spoke of surprise and respect. Margaret reached the bridge of the song, the part where the melody swelled, and her voice had to rise higher than before. She closed her eyes again, summoning every ounce of strength, every memory, every piece of love she carried in her heart. Her voice soared, filling the theater with power and emotion. It was the kind of voice that seemed to rise above age, above doubt, above fear. When she opened her eyes, she noticed something she had not expected. The audience was not only listening, they were moved. Some were wiping tears. Others were holding their breath. The room was silent, not because they were waiting to laugh, but because they didn't want to miss a single note. And then, as she carried the song toward its final chorus, Margaret herself began to feel lighter. It was as if years of being overlooked, years of hiding her dream, were being lifted from her shoulders. This performance was not just for the competition. It was for every moment in her life that had told her she couldn't. And here she was, proving that she could. The music swelled again, and her voice matched it perfectly, ringing with passion and clarity. The once doubting crowd was now with her, every step of the way, holding onto each word as though it mattered deeply to them too. By the time she approached the final chorus, there was no question left in the room. Margaret had not just come to sing, she had come to touch hearts. And she was doing exactly that. As the last notes of the chorus rose in the air, Margaret felt no fear, no doubt. She only felt gratitude for the chance, for the song, for the moment she had waited her whole life for. And still, she wasn't finished. The most powerful part was yet to come. The first two verses had already changed the mood in the theater, but the true test was still ahead. Margaret was about to reach the part of the song that demanded everything from her: voice strength, range, and emotion. It was the point where most singers either soared or stumbled. For Margaret, it was the moment that would define her performance. The music swelled, growing louder and more dramatic. The crowd leaned forward again, this time not in doubt but in anticipation. Nobody was laughing now. Their eyes were fixed on the old woman standing alone under the stage lights, a woman who had walked in with shaky hands but now stood tall with a calm fire in her eyes. Margaret took a deep breath as the bridge began. She felt the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders, but instead of fear, she felt something else: release. This was the moment she had been waiting for her entire life. Every year of silence, every sacrifice, every buried dream was building toward this single point. And when she opened her mouth, the sound that came out was unlike anything the audience expected. Her voice soared, rising higher and higher, filling every corner of the theater. It was powerful but also tender, like a wave crashing and then gently pulling back. The strength of her singing surprised even her. It was as though decades of life had been stored inside her chest, and now, at last, the door had opened. Gasps came from the audience. A young man in the second row put his hand over his mouth in disbelief. A woman clutched her friend's arm as tears welled in her eyes. Even the camera operators, usually focused only on capturing the right angles, found themselves swept away by the sound. The judges, too, were changed. The woman judge who had earlier shared a laugh with the famous singer now leaned forward with her hand on her chin, her face glowing with awe. Another judge nodded slowly, his lips slightly parted, as though he had forgotten this was a competition and was simply listening to something pure. And then there was the famous singer, the one who had mocked her with a smirk and a careless remark. His expression had completely shifted. The playfulness was gone, replaced by concentration. His eyes were locked on Margaret, and though he tried to hide it, his face showed surprise, even admiration. It was clear he hadn't expected this. Nobody had. Margaret sang on, her voice carrying the story of her life. Every note was a piece of her heart, every phrase a memory, every high note a triumph over years of doubt. She wasn't just performing a song, she was living it, breathing it, pouring herself into it. The bridge reached its peak, and Margaret hit the most difficult note of the entire piece. It rang out, strong and steady, hanging in the air like a bell. The audience held its breath. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. That single note seemed to say everything words could not: about courage, about never giving up, about the beauty of dreams that survive even when the world forgets them. When she finally released the note and moved into the final chorus, the theater erupted in energy. The audience, who had been silent and tense with anticipation, now burst into applause even before the song was finished. People clapped along with the rhythm, some shouting encouragement, their earlier doubts completely erased. Margaret felt it too. She could feel the warmth of their support washing over her like sunlight. It gave her strength, and the last chorus was the best she had ever sung in her life. Her voice soared with confidence, rising above the music, above the stage, above every limitation anyone had ever placed on her. By the time she reached the final line, the audience was already on their feet. She sang the last note with everything she had, holding it just long enough to let it sink deep into the hearts of everyone listening. And then, when the music stopped, the theater was silent for a split second, an almost sacred silence before the world erupted. The applause was thunderous. People stood, clapping and cheering, shouting her name. Some waved their arms, others whistled, and many simply stood frozen with tears in their eyes. It was as if the entire theater had been transformed from a place of doubt and laughter to a place of respect and awe. Margaret stood there, slightly out of breath, her chest rising and falling, her hands trembling again, but this time, not from fear. This time, it was from the overwhelming feeling of victory, of finally being heard. Her eyes shone as she looked out at the sea of faces, so different now from the ones that had doubted her only minutes earlier. The judges, too, were on their feet. The woman judge clapped with a wide smile, her eyes sparkling. The man beside her wiped the corner of his eye discreetly, though cameras caught it anyway. And the famous singer, the one who had mocked her most, stood up slowly, his hands coming together in applause. The smirk was gone. In its place was something softer, something genuine. He clapped for her, nodding as if to admit that she had done something even he, with all his fame and talent, could not ignore. The host ran onto the stage, his face glowing with excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted above the roar of the crowd, "Margaret." The cheers grew even louder. The old woman, who had walked onto the stage to whispers and laughter, was now standing in the middle of a standing ovation. Margaret smiled, not proudly, but humbly. She wasn't thinking about the judges or the cameras anymore. She was thinking about her family, about her grandchildren watching at home, about the promise she had made to herself that she would try, no matter what anyone thought. She bowed her head slightly, thanking the crowd with a gesture that was as simple and genuine as her dress and her presence. For her, this moment wasn't about fame or winning. It was about proving that it's never too late, that dreams don't have an expiration date, and that sometimes, the most powerful voices are the ones people almost didn't listen to. As she left the stage, the applause continued, echoing behind her like waves. She walked slowly, her heart full, her soul lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like just a grandmother, or just an old woman. She felt like a singer, a real one, standing where she belonged. And though she didn't know what the judges would say yet, it didn't matter. She had already won in the ways that truly counted. The sound of applause still rang in Margaret's ears long after she stepped back from the microphone. She stood in the center of the stage, her eyes shining, her chest rising and falling as if she had just finished running a race. But it was not exhaustion she felt, it was relief, it was release, and it was joy. The lights felt brighter now, not harsh but warm, as if the stage itself was welcoming her instead of questioning her. The audience was still on its feet, clapping, cheering, calling her name. Some people waved their arms, others wiped away tears. The theater, which only minutes before had been filled with whispers and chuckles, had transformed into a place of unity and respect. Margaret looked around, trying to take it all in. She could hardly believe this was happening. For so many years she had sung only in kitchens, in living rooms, or in the quiet of her church. And now she stood before hundreds, maybe millions watching at home, and they were clapping for her. The host came rushing back to the stage, his face glowing with excitement. "Margaret," he shouted again, gesturing to the crowd as if inviting them to make even more noise. The crowd happily obeyed, their cheers rising higher. Margaret smiled and gave a small bow, humble and graceful, as if to say thank you without words. Then the applause softened as the host turned toward the judges. "Well," he said, his voice carrying that familiar showman's excitement, "I think it's time to hear what our judges have to say." Margaret felt her heart flutter again. She had faced the laughter of the crowd, and she had silenced it with her song. But now came another moment, the judgment of those who held the power to decide her place in the competition. She took another deep breath and waited, her hands resting gently in front of her. The first judge leaned toward her microphone. She was a woman known for her warmth but also her honesty. Her face was glowing with admiration. "Margaret," she said, pausing for a moment to steady her voice, "when you walked onto the stage, I wasn't sure what to expect. But the moment you began singing, I knew we were witnessing something special. You didn't just sing tonight, you shared your heart with us. And I want to thank you for that. The crowd clapped again, a softer wave this time, as Margaret nodded, touched by the kind words. The second judge leaned forward next. He was often quiet, choosing his words carefully. "Your performance reminded me of something very important," he said. "Music is not about age, it is not about how you look, or even about fame. It's about truth. And you sang with truth. That is why we all felt it." More applause rose from the audience. Margaret's eyes shimmered with gratitude. She had not expected such kindness, but here it was, flowing toward her like a gift. And then came the third judge, the famous singer, the one who had mocked her earlier. The room grew quiet, as if everyone was waiting to hear what he would say. His reputation for sharp comments was well known, and many expected him to find some flaw, some way to soften the moment. He leaned toward the microphone slowly. His face, once playful and mocking, was now serious. He looked directly at Margaret, his eyes steady. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence stretched. Then finally, he spoke. "When you walked onto the stage," he began, "I admit I did not believe in you. I even made a joke, and for that, I was wrong." The crowd murmured softly at his honesty. "But then you opened your mouth, and from the very first note, everything changed. What you gave us tonight was more than a performance. It was a lesson. You reminded me, and everyone here, that music has no age. Talent has no limit. And spirit never grows old." The crowd erupted again, clapping and cheering even louder than before. Some people shouted his words back, repeating, "Spirit never grows old." The famous singer himself began to clap, his face open and full of respect. Margaret felt her heart swell. She hadn't needed his approval, but to hear it, to see the respect in his eyes after all the doubt, was like a final piece falling into place. She nodded gently, smiling without pride but with gratitude. The host raised his arms to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, can we all agree? Margaret has given us a night we will never forget." The audience roared once again, standing tall, clapping until their hands were sore. The camera lights flashed, capturing the moment for millions to see later. Margaret stood there, soaking it in, but also feeling something deeper. She realized that this moment was not just hers, it belonged to everyone who had ever felt too small, too old, or too overlooked. She thought of her grandchildren, watching at home. She imagined them jumping up and down on the couch, shouting, "That's our grandma." She thought of her late husband, his gentle smile and his quiet encouragement through the years. She felt him with her, as if he were standing in the wings, clapping too. The music of the show played softly in the background as the host helped guide Margaret off the stage. But the applause followed her, echoing down the hallway behind the curtains. She walked slowly, her steps steady now, her heart full. Backstage, people came up to her, technicians, stage assistants, even other contestants. They smiled, clapped her shoulder, and told her how incredible she had been. Some had tears in their eyes. "You inspired us," one young singer said, her voice trembling. "If you can do this, then maybe I can too." Margaret touched her hand gently and said, "Never stop singing if you love it. Never stop." As she sat down in a quiet corner, away from the lights, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet thank you not just to the audience or the judges, but to life itself, for giving her this moment. It was not about winning anymore. It was not about the prize or the title. It was about being heard, about proving that dreams could live even when they were buried deep. Tonight, she had shown the world that. And more importantly, she had shown herself. The sound of applause still echoed faintly through the walls, a memory she knew would stay with her forever. She smiled softly, whispering to herself, "It's never too late." For the first time in years, Margaret felt free not just as a singer, but as a woman who had finally stood up for her own dream. And little did she know, the world outside the theater was already talking about her. Videos were being uploaded, comments were being shared, and hearts were being moved in homes across the country. Margaret's voice was no longer just hers. It was becoming a voice for everyone. The night had ended, but the memory of it lived on as if it would never fade. Margaret sat quietly in her small dressing room after leaving the stage, still trying to take in everything that had happened. She could hear the muffled sounds of other contestants preparing to sing, the chatter of crew members, and the movement of people backstage. But in her heart, it was as if time had slowed. She held onto the echo of the applause, the sight of the audience rising to their feet, and the respect in the eyes of the judges. She leaned back in her chair, looking at herself in the mirror. The reflection staring back was not the same woman who had walked on stage earlier. That woman had carried the weight of doubt, the sting of laughter, and the fear of failure. The woman in the mirror now had lines on her face, yes, but those lines glowed with pride. Her eyes were brighter, her shoulders lighter, and her heart fuller. Margaret whispered softly to herself, "I did it." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. She had done something she once thought impossible. She had silenced doubt not with arguments or anger, but with the strength of her voice. She had shown the world what she had always known deep down, that her gift had never left her. It had only been waiting for the right moment to shine. Back in the theater, people were still talking about her. Audience members told one another they had witnessed history. Some were on their phones, already posting videos and messages. An old woman just blew the roof off the stage, one person typed. "I laughed at first, but she made me cry," another wrote. Social media filled quickly with clips of her performance, her name spreading faster than she could imagine. At home, her grandchildren were indeed jumping up and down, clapping and cheering for their grandmother. "That's Grandma! That's Grandma!" they shouted, their little voices filled with pride. Her children wiped tears from their eyes, remembering all the years they had heard her sing in the kitchen, never imagining that one day the world would hear her too. And beyond her family, strangers across the country, even across the world, were discovering her voice. Some were inspired to chase their own dreams, no matter their age. Others simply found comfort in her courage, reminded that life is not about how old you are, but how willing you are to try. The producers of the show came to her dressing room, smiling warmly. "Margaret," one of them said, "you've become the highlight of the night. People are already talking about you. You've touched so many hearts." She thanked them humbly, her smile quiet and kind. She had not come for fame, but if her story could inspire others, she was grateful. Later, when the show ended and the cameras stopped rolling, Margaret stepped out into the cool night air. The city lights sparkled, and the air was crisp. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and walked slowly, breathing deeply. She felt lighter than she had in years, as if a burden had been lifted. For so long, she had believed her chance had passed her by. But tonight, she had learned that chances can return when you least expect them. In the days that followed, the world did not forget her. Newspapers wrote about her performance, calling it one of the most moving moments in the show's history. Headlines read, "Grandmother silences the world with her voice and age is just a number, Margaret's song inspires millions." Television shows replayed her audition, and clips of her singing spread everywhere. People who had never met her spoke her name with admiration. Margaret's phone rang constantly. Friends called to congratulate her, people from her church sent messages of love, and even strangers found ways to write to her, telling her how her courage had inspired them to try something they had long given up on. She read every message, often with tears in her eyes. She realized her voice had done more than win applause, it had awakened hope. When she walked through her small town, people stopped her on the street. "Margaret, we saw you on TV. You were amazing," they said. Children waved at her, calling her a star. She would laugh softly and shake her head, saying, "I'm no star. I'm just someone who loves to sing." But deep down, she knew something had changed forever. She had become a symbol of possibility, not just for older people, but for anyone who had ever been told they couldn't chase their dreams. One evening, as she sat by her window, watching the sunset, Margaret thought of her husband again. She imagined him sitting beside her, smiling that familiar smile. "You always believed in me," she whispered. "I hope you're proud." She felt certain he was. The competition itself continued, with many young singers showing off their talent. But Margaret's performance remained the one people spoke about. The judges mentioned her often, not just for her voice but for the way she carried herself with grace, humility, and strength. Even the famous singer who had once mocked her became one of her biggest supporters. In interviews, he admitted that Margaret had taught him something important, that music is about soul, not appearance. As weeks went by, Margaret returned to the stage again and again, each time surprising people with her talent. She didn't always sing the loudest or the flashiest songs, but she sang with heart, and that was enough. Sometimes she chose songs that told stories, songs that carried emotion. And every time, the audience listened with respect. But for Margaret, the true victory had already happened the night she first sang and silenced the laughter. Whether she won the competition or not didn't matter. She had already won something greater, the rediscovery of her dream and the knowledge that she was never too late to live it. The story of Margaret's audition spread far beyond the stage. It was shared in classrooms where teachers told students to never give up. It was spoken about in offices, where workers reminded each other that it's never too late to start something new. It was told in families, where grandparents felt encouraged and grandchildren learned to respect the wisdom of age. Margaret became more than a contestant. She became a reminder. Her life showed that no matter the years that pass, the spark of a dream can always be reignited. And as for Margaret herself, she carried on singing. Not for fame, not for money, but for the pure love of it. She sang at home, in her church, to her grandchildren, and whenever she felt joy. She knew now that her voice was not just hers, it belonged to the people who found hope in it. When people asked her later how it felt to silence the world with her song, she would smile gently and say, "It wasn't about silencing the world. It was about letting the world finally listen." And in that simple answer lay the truth of her story. Margaret had shown that dreams never age, that courage can shine at any time, and that sometimes the most unexpected voices are the ones that touch us the deepest. The night she sang would be remembered for years, not because an old woman had surprised the world, but because she had reminded it of something timeless, the beauty of a heart that refuses to stop dreaming.